The amounts of demands, the changes that we're facing and will continue to face are larger, more numerous, and coming all at the same time.
What would be the first stage of noticing the difference between a break and possibly needing more time off?
How do we think about mental health? How do we talk about it? Do we share what's going well, what's a challenge, ways in which we build it?
How do negative relationships or negative interactions with people impact resilience?
If we want to increase my resilience here, I'm going to need a pillar focused on boundaries.
How do we create a resilience plan? And why do we need it? Hi, welcome to the Signature Leadership Show, where we help world-class leaders identify and discover their authentic selves. And in the process, we discover our own. Our guest today is Dr. Marie-Hélène Pelletier, better known to her colleagues as MH, which is also a handy reference for mental health. So the short form is a great fit. She's a psychologist with a systems mind and has both a PhD and an MBA. She has over 20 years of experience as a practicing psychologist and as a senior leader in the corporate, insurance, governance, and healthcare sectors. MH's unique talent is bringing together workplace and psychology, translating concepts into takeaways that listeners can put into action the minute they finish the episode, which I love. In 2024, Dr. Pelletier will release her new book, which is what we're going to talk about today, The Resilience Plan, a strategic approach to optimizing your work performance and mental health. Welcome, Dr. Pelletier.
Thank you, Jamie. It's a pleasure to be here.
Before we dive into the book, what is the necessary context or background to better understand who you are from your earlier years? Or what do we want to know from the past that's helped you become the psychologist, the author, and the thought leader you are today?
Probably the common thread is following my nose. And so following my nose in what I was interested in, originally different areas, but one of them was psychology. Then work and life brought me in northern Quebec because my husband, Nick, was in mining, still is in mining, and still is my husband. But we were in northern Quebec. But living in a very small remote community well before all this technology was connecting us was a very unique experience that led me to wanting to do research on using technology to connect people 20 years ago, telehealth, which now, of course, is very obvious, but at the time it wasn't. But it also required, doing this research, a lot of funding, which meant I have to manage a lot of money, which then led me to say, I enjoy management. Let's do an MBA, which then led to the leadership roles, the interest of combining business and psychology. So it really is following my nose.
When you say following that path, why did you write this book? Did it have something to do with that cumulative experience that brought you to this point?
It absolutely is. Yes. It is in the conversations with my individual coaching clients or my the audiences when I was speaking, when I speak in general, where very often people would say things like, oh, this is now so very helpful for me. I'm glad I have this moving forward. And I wish I had this earlier. I wish I knew this earlier. And it is with this realization that I thought, okay, wait, if I actually can take a moment, a long moment, to write the book and put it together, then I have that opportunity to save time for people, save money, save pain, save burnouts in some cases by bringing some of these concepts together. And so that's why the book happened.
And one of what you just said there in reading most of the book, can you give an example from your own experience as a psychologist or working with a team where you were helping someone deal with burnout at any stage in the process? What does it look like?
Yes. Well, thank you for mentioning this piece about any stage of the process. I'll give you two examples, an earlier stage and a later stage. Because what often happens is there are signs of we're in an earlier stage, but we're not paying attention. We're disregarding these signs. We're keeping going. And the more, both for ourselves and people around us, we can catch these signs, the better, right? So, in early signs, before you get exhausted, you just have less energy most of the time. Before you're cynical, you're just less engaged. And before you're in like full on performance management, you're making more mistakes. So, as either a leader looking at your team or as an individual just looking at your own situation, I've seen people where they notice these things. They notice, for example, one person I worked with, I was asking, have you seen some impacts on your performance, for example? And it was like, no, not really. I can always catch these things. And I said, well, so the types of things that are falling through the cracks are similar to before. And they're like, well, no, actually, last week I ended up sending the wrong proposal to the wrong client. That's very far from my usual. I mean, I managed it, da, da, da. But that's an example of we're seeing signs proactively, but we're disregarding them as it's fine. I figured it out. The reality, it was more than before, and we want to pay attention. Right? So that's an example of catching it sooner. The catching it later is a bit easier to see in some ways. Most of the time, people will start feeling quite horrible leading into going to work. So I've had people say, I can still manage to go to work and do my day, but I'm crying in the car. Well, no. When I had a client tell me exactly this, and I said, and how many times in your life so far has that happened? First time. So you see, even when we're there, sometimes we've been so capable, resourceful, making things happen that we can disregard, but we want to pay attention.
And in chapter 8, you talk about the difference between, if I'm not mistaken, please tell me if I am, the difference between needing an absence, a prolonged absence from work, and needing a break.
Mm-hmm.
How would you define the difference in looking at yourself, even though if you're not a professional psychologist, you would reach out to someone like you? What would be the first stage of noticing the difference between a break and possibly needing more time off?
Yes. So the first thing I would say is it's exactly what you said there. Ultimately, you want to connect with a professional because we're really not good at picking up on our own cues. We either minimize them or, well, most of the time people minimize them, really. We could make them worse, but I have not seen this very much. Most of what I see is we minimize them. So if I often say to people, if you're wondering, I would say go talk to a psychologist, talk to your physician, nurse practitioner, any registered health professional around in your support network to get their opinion. As an individual, you're really looking at a few things. Are the signs that you're seeing, you're looking at their frequency. Are they happening often or not? You're looking at their severity. When they do happen, is it fairly severe or is it just light? And I'll give you an example in a second. And is it impacting your functioning? So let's say, for example, you're feeling tired, you're just, your concentration is not what it used to be. And you're like, oh, do I just need a break because my concentration is not great? Or am I needing a leave of absence? Well, then look at, is it happening often? Well, in the past couple of weeks, only once. Okay. When it happens, is this fairly severe impact? No, I just reread the thing 2 times instead of 1. And is it impacting functioning? No. But if it is happening multiple times a day, every day, if it's when it happens, it has led to you missing a key deadline. Okay, so now it's more significant in terms of impact. And yeah, it is impacting your functioning because now your performance is going to get on the line. Then that's what I would say. Absolutely connect with a health professional to get that other opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Just taking a step back, how do you define resilience?
Yeah. Yes. And that valid question, because there are actually many definitions. If we looked at the academic literature. The different researchers use different ones, but the one I use, and it is very often what many have used as well, our ability to go through adversity and come out even stronger.
Mm.
Okay. And so by adversity here, often we think an acute event, and of course that includes that, but it also includes chronic demands. So pandemic, chronic demand. The just AI coming in our lives, personal and professional, chronic demand. Whether you see it as positive or challenging, it's still a change and therefore represents a demand. Right? And then this notion of we're growing from it. There's this growth mindset, this learning opportunity.
What about when it comes to resilience, relationships?
Yeah.
How do relationships play a role in our ability to develop resilience?
They are a key part to our resilience. In fact, there are many aspects, many areas we could pay attention to that will increase our resilience, our baseline, if we want to call it that way. And research points to 4 key areas, and we've heard them even more in the context of the pandemic, but they're true and they're research based. So some of them, like exercise, which we want 3 types: cardio, strength training, and meditative type activity, nutrition, sleep. But one of them, the fourth, or it doesn't need to be in that order, are relationships. And I love that you bring this question up, because often very driven professionals and leaders tend to focus on the other pieces. Oh, my sleep, my exercise, my nutrition, and relationship. Well, if I have time. Or yes, I did book a wonderful lunch with Jamie, but if Jamie gets busy, he might say, MH, I can't make it. Let's push it to another date. If I'm busy, I may say, Jamie, there's no way I can actually carve time out. Right? We do this, don't we? And what we now know from research is that no, these moments should be considered equally as important as the others. We want to treat them that way. So sometimes what I say to people who, tend to be a bit like this, thinking we can put it aside, is consider that date you had with a colleague or a good friend the same way you would consider an appointment with a specialist physician you've been waiting for 9 months. You would
Mhm.
make it happen. Even if you were busy, you would make it happen and your day would not suffer that much. You would figure it out. Same. We need to keep these things in.
So, from what I'm hearing, that's the positive side of building relationships to
Yeah.
help you in your resilience.
Yes.
What about on the opposite end? How do negative relationships or negative interactions with people impact resilience?
Hey, I would say if I'm using the language that I'm proposing, say in the book or often in my work with busy people, it becomes, you need to treat it that way. It becomes a demand, because the interaction is challenging. So you find yourself thinking about it after, want it or not. Sometimes it wakes you up during the night, or it pops up as you're trying to focus on something else. It it creates an emotional demand as well. Usually, that will come with this. Sometimes it will even have impact on our behaviors. Like we end up being impatient with someone else, where that's so. But what we tend to do as busy professionals and leaders is that too, push it aside. I've got all these other things to do, keep going, keep moving on. And so if instead we just recognize it for what it is, we don't need to give it more importance than what it has, but we don't want to minimize it either. And so if we recognize it as a demand that it is, then it means we will likely see it as something to be managed, just like so many other things we do, which then means we will create space for ourselves to think about this. Okay, there's been this conflict or this challenging interaction. I'll step back and think about, however you like to think about these things. How would I support a good friend going through this? What kinds of things I would perhaps recommend they do? And have I tried these things? And maybe I need to actually, put other things aside for right now and actually give it the attention it needs to have so we can all continue and progress.
So one more question along that front,
Yeah.
a nuanced question. So that's about how we have to deal with things that are demanding our attention and the emotional toll.
Mhm.
What about unresolved conflict or things that we have been putting off or that are causing us to be resentful or to hold in, and for whatever reason we haven't dealt with it either professionally or personally? And often I find that with people, anecdotally, it impacts them. So personally it impacts them, professionally it impacts them personally. So my question is, doctor, what do you suggest someone do with this unresolved conflict that they might be experiencing in order to build more resilience in the long term?
Yes. Well, ignore it, Jimmy. No, I'm kidding. Um,
Perfect.
Pay attention to it. And it's one of those things. It's almost like when we were in school and really hoping they wouldn't ask that question on the test. And the best advice was, yeah, well, prepare for the worst question they can probably ask you. Do it, prepare, practice it. It's almost a similar approach here. We so don't want to. We so hope that if we continue to ignore it, it will calm down, go away, get out. But then we know it's here. And so it does need attention. What I found, of course, given the work that I do, most of the time when it gets to me, it's because they've decided to talk to someone about it, whether it's in my coaching work or in my psychology practice work. And I find that sometimes that is the most efficient way to get to it with someone, because obviously, if it was relatively simple, you would have dealt with it already. Right? And we haven't for some reason. And the reasons can vary broadly for all kinds of reasons. And so sometimes that is a really good investment. And I'm not talking about years of therapy at all, but sometimes people will read books on topics related to what they see as the reason for their challenge, for example, which sometimes works. But then again, that too will take more time. And even though I just wrote a book and certainly value what books can bring, for what you're describing, in my opinion, the most efficient is to talk to a professional who will help you get to exactly what is the situation. Because sometimes these unresolved conflicts are with someone who's not even here anymore. They may have passed away, for example. And so it's still here, it needs to be managed, and there are ways to help people with these issues. So it's a broad question and I'm giving a broad answer in some ways, but the direction is yes, needs to be addressed, probably the fastest with a professional so that it can help you get exactly where you need to get to.
Well, conflict is one of the areas that when I speak with CEO groups comes up regularly, of something that impacts their mental health.
Mm-hmm.
What do you believe are some of the other barriers in the workplace to having better mental health awareness?
What I've seen different ones. Probably I'll start with, because it depends immensely, obviously, on the particular group, the culture of that group. But I would say is what place does mental health currently have in your culture? There are cultures where we've been so focused on high performance, high pressure, whatever, all kinds of aspects of important cultures where this has been the main focus. There are usually mentions, especially now. It's rare that there will be zero mention of it. But does it have the space it needs to have to really optimize where you want to go as a business, as an organization? So let's say, what have we done in our culture to nourish the importance of mental health? And that's sometimes culture, people are like, well, that's a vague term and all this. Culture is think of it as the ways in which we think about the particular topic. So in this group, how do we think about mental health? How do we talk about it? Do we share what's going well, what's a challenge, ways in which we build it, that kind of thing? If we're not investing, that's a barrier. And sometimes there will be, not only we're not talking about it, but when we talk about it, we're talking about it in negative ways. And sometimes, obviously, it's never voluntary. But if, as a leader, you hear yourself or you hear others say, "Oh, Jamie, best employee ever. He's been here 15 years, never a sick day." What I'm conveying here is that somehow none of us ever need to take care of our health, and that I value that as a leader. Not exactly the message. So that's another example of a barrier, because now, are you going to tell me that you may need time off? Or is someone hearing me say this to you that's around us believe that they can talk to me or you about it? No, they can't. So these are examples of ways in which sometimes we'll create barriers involuntarily.
What role does emotional intelligence play in a leader's ability to demonstrate resilience and adapt to changing circumstances, considering we've been in changing circumstances and uncertainty for years now?
Yes, and we will be. if
Yes.
right, looking at again AI coming into our lives and all this, lots of connections. So the research behind emotional intelligence is very solid, the same way research behind resilience is. One of the common aspects is the importance of self-awareness. And as we're if we've learned and invested in our emotional intelligence, you would have heard how critical it is, that central, that comes first, that necessity for us, as much as we can, even if when we have so many other things to focus on, to take brief moments, and we get better and better the more we practice, to check in with ourselves and know where we're at, that self-awareness. And so whether we invest in our self-awareness from an emotional intelligence perspective or a resilience perspective, it's sort of a, you invest in one place, benefit in both. So they're connected in many ways, but that's one of the key ways in which they are connected.
Okay. Your book, you lay out this very practical and useful plan, the resilience plan. How do we create a resilience plan, and why do we need it?
I know we need it. We need it now, I would say, especially because, and I'll get back to how in a quick second, but we need it because the amounts of demands, the changes that we're facing and will continue to face are larger and more numerous and coming all at the same time. And for many of us, of course, as career continues to grow and expand, they get more challenging. We want that in a number of ways, but that's still representing even more demands. So if we were to not have a plan, we would be like someone who's saying, okay, I'm taking my casual running to training for an ultra marathon, and I'm not getting particular shoes to do this. Well, you're going to get hurt. Right? So you need the equipment. So in some ways, that's the equipment. That's the why you need to do this. You need equipment. How? High level, what I'm helping us think through in the book, I've just distilled a few areas that are just the minimum aspects of what we need to create a plan there. And they're very similar to what we would use in business, really. But the analogy I give sometimes is, if we were in a business context and we were wanting to launch a new service or a new product, would we just have that fantastic idea and proceed? Or we would have that fantastic idea and look at, okay, who else is providing this kind of service? What are the forces that may impact it? What may help? What may represent a challenge? What is a unique differentiator from my perspective? What values are we bringing to it? And all this. So we would do all this. Yeah. So same thing here. The way I'm proposing we get to having a plan is by gaining even more clarity on our values, more clarity on our sources of what I call supply and demand right now, more clarity on our context, internal to us, what helps and what doesn't, external to us, what helps and what doesn't now. So not in general in my whatever many decades of life. And then with that in mind, we get to creating a plan much like we would do in a business context here. So let's say my goal is increase my resilience. And then strategic pillars. What are my 3 pillars now, given my context? And I can give you an example in a second if you'd like. And then tactics or actions for each pillar, the same way we would do in business. And that's it. That's how you get to a plan.
You said you'd give an example. Can you give one example?
Of course, happy to do that. And it will be very different for each of us. It will be different for us today and for us in 6 months from now. Right? So, but I worked with someone where we were actually in an interview like this, and we had more time and all, and we just actually did some of that plan for that person. I was asking Then, okay, what kinds of values? Value family, value health, value intellectual challenges, the challenges that they were getting from their particular work situation. They love that. Okay, great. There were other values, but for right now, let's just stay with this high level. Then we looked at, okay, what are yours, in this case, that person's sources of supply and demand? Supply, they are in a good relationship right now, but that's mostly it. There was not much of other things they were doing. Demands, very challenging work that they enjoyed. They enjoyed their work culture. They happened to be in a good place, good team. That's good. They had just been promoted, so positive, but a demand still. And so there were things like that. Okay. Then we looked at that person's context, internal and external. I won't go through all the details just for time purposes, but we looked at all this. And so then, as the person looked at their values, their sources of supply and demand, their context, they said, okay, if we want to increase my resilience here, I'm going to need a pillar focused on boundaries. Because right now, there are many good things happening. I'm saying yes to these things, work things mostly. But then I value health and family. And right now, not much is happening here. So I'm going to need better boundaries. That wasn't one of their pillars. They had another pillar that for them was focused on health because they value health and had not invested much in it. And they had another pillar. And in the first pillar for boundaries, for example, they created actions or tactics here for themselves, but we always very much want them to be realistic. So doable, you can do them tomorrow. So not like aspirational, fabulous, and big. No, because these don't happen. So very concrete. So for that particular person, they actually had realized how they always tend to think that something's going to take less time than it does. So they increased their buffer. When they were committing to something, they would say in their head, I think this is going to take me half an hour. I'm going to tell myself it's going to take me an hour. So that I'm putting boundaries to myself to not accept too many things. That was one of their actions. On the health side, one of the things they had still not done and they knew of the research was meditation. That was their next action, specifically to just download one app. Not do anything with it yet, just the action of downloading. You see, this is like, whatever, 2 minutes action. So this is an example of what it looked like for one person.
Amazing. So I'd encourage you to check out the plan within the book because it really gives you a blueprint of how to build this particular essential characteristic. As we move to our final part, what I'd love to ask is for you, Dr. Pelletier, can you share a story that embodies when you've demonstrated resilience over the course of your life? One story that demonstrates when you showed up at your best with resilience when you needed it. What happened?
Well, I've actually applied this for writing this book because, often, or a few times people have asked me, oh, how did you fit that in writing a book? Like all of our lives are full already. And I did not fit it in. I planned for it. And I would not have been able to show with resilience if I didn't do it this way. So in this case, for me, what it meant is, so I had, just like all of us, for real, like life full/overflowing. So absolutely no time extra to do this. And so I gathered a lot of information about what's realistically required in terms of time, looked at my schedule, when was this possible, looked at my overall life, other important, my personal commitments to myself, yes, but also my family, my friends, my, other things in my life, so that I would organize it to happen at a time that I had created space. I had to say no to some other things. I had to take things out of my other commitments that I loved. I moved it twice, the moment where I would do it, because it was still not looking like this. And had I not done this seriously, I think it would have started and not gone very far. But because I, in some ways, thankfully, applied some of what I'm suggesting in the book there, it did allow me to show with resilience, because writing a book, is not actually just work or time or whatever. It's really hard and demanding in all the ways you think, even if it's like, yeah, it's a nonfiction. No, it's demanding. And so, and for me, it actually turned out to be one of the most enjoyable professional experiences I've had. And it is in part because I set up as many of the things I could control, so many I couldn't, but those that I could, yeah, that's how I did.
And just quickly, what's a book that you're reading or you've read recently that you really felt was impactful on this subject or something related to leadership?
The book, I've known this book for a long time, so it's not a recent, but it's something I always recommend for everyone. And I'm very lucky to have one of the authors of that book as an endorser for my book. But it's Mind Over Mood. Mind Over Mood. It was written by Greenberger and Podesky. It's now a second edition, over 1 million sold, 23 languages, all that. And it's coming from psychology, really, but it is a workbook with a lot of exercises in it that, even though they were originally designed for people who maybe say wanting to make sure people who are possibly struggling with their mood or anxiety or anger or frustration, all kinds of things, I think it's a book everyone should have in their office or in their home or both, because it allows us to think about things proactively in a very effective way. We know it's research based. So Mind Over Mood would be that book.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. My last question is, it loops back to something that I felt was a really profound takeaway earlier in our conversation when I asked you about burnout.
Hmm.
And you talked about one of the signs of burnout is cynicism
Yeah.
as opposed to hope. So I'd like to actually end on a hopeful note. I believe that what is lasts and leaves an impression. So this is a question for you, Dr. Pelletier. If we were back together 1 year from now, celebrating that your book and your work has evolved and grown beyond what you could have ever imagined was possible, what are the three things that we're celebrating?
Ah, well, that is a fun question. Thank you for asking. Okay. Um, well, uh, I would have enhanced my exposure to senior level groups that need this message and don't tend to want to talk about it. So enhanced that exposure significantly. Um, increased demands even more, especially for my speaking and executive coaching work, and opened doors that a year ago I could not even have told you existed.
Wonderful. So I encourage you who are listening to find the Resilience Plan, a strategic approach to optimizing your work performance and mental health by Dr. Marie-Hélène Pelletier. Where can we find you and find the book?
You can find the book anywhere where you buy your books, online, in person. If you go to your local bookstore and you don't see it there, you can ask them to bring it in. Always love supporting local bookstores. You can go to your library and ask them to bring it in as well. But otherwise, theresilienceplan.com is where it's going to lead you to all my work. If you like to consume books audio, I did record it, French accent and all. I did it. So it exists that way as well. And of course, LinkedIn. Always love to connect with people there. And also, it's a nice way, if this is an area that people value, I and many others, of course, post messages, content about it. And sometimes just adding your voice is a way to bring these messages to your own networks.
Thanks for this insightful and enjoyable conversation.
Thanks, Jamie. It was a pleasure to speak with you.
The pleasure.